It's ding ding, two men in a ring. We put pride in your stride and a quiver in your liver. You want 'em, we've got 'em, coming to you. Loud and proud, he's the biggest, he's the baddest. It's Mr. Gavin Davis on the Gavin Davis Podcast Show.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Gavin Davis Podcast, featuring my co-host, Dave Bruff. Tonight, we are going to talk about the origins of British Jujitsu, and who better to talk about that subject with than Dave Bruff. So, how's Dave? You okay, mate?
Very well, thanks, Gav. Very well. Looking forward to this. It's an interesting subject, and there's a lot of parallels across a lot of the things we've been discussing today, so it should be interesting.
Okay, mate. So, first question for you. How did Jiu-Jitsu first come to the UK?
Okay, well, I mean, it was appearing in media, in articles in the late 19th century, but the credit for bringing Jiu-Jitsu and Judo to the UK goes down to this guy called Edward William Barton Wright. Now, I'm just going to share my screen, Gav, and show a picture of him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
So this guy here with the big moustache, he was actually a railway engineer, and in the late 1800s, he was living in Japan, and he was training judo, and he was training old Koryu styles of jujutsu, and he was a self-defense enthusiast. And he came back to the UK late 1800s, and in 1898, 1899, he started writing articles, and it was on his new art of self-defense, and he called it Bartitsu, which was a fusion of his name, Barton, with Jiu-Jitsu. And it was a combination of Jiu-Jitsu, stick fighting, French kickboxing, savate, and wrestling, and fencing. And he had this school of arms in London, where he took these experts. And to do the Jiu-Jitsu, he invited, through correspondence with Jigoro Kano, who was the founder of Judo, he invited these two young Jiu-Jitsu experts across. Now, there were a few came across, but the ones that stuck were these two. Right, where's this image? Can you see this image? Here. Okay, so the guy doing the scissors throw is Sadakazu Yoneshi. He came over in 1900, and just before him, the guy standing up came over, and he was called Yukio Tani. And they were with Barton Wright for a couple of years. Bartitsu only lasted a couple of years, and it died out. But what Barton Wright wanted to do was take these guys, their expertise, and go into the music hall scene. So the music halls were these theaters for the big variety shows. So you'd have comedians, ventriloquists, actresses, and so on. But you'd also have performers. And these guys would go on and fight all comers, basically, with a rule set. The rule, the opponents had to wear a jacket. They would fight wrestlers and so on. And it became a bit of a sensation. And there was actually an argument between Yukio Tani and Barton Wright. And in years later, when Barton Wright was asked about this, he claimed to have beaten Yukio Tani and thrown him out, which no other commentator believes. People believe that Tani would have been too much for him. But these guys then, they probably thought they could make more money without Barton Wright, and they set up themselves. This guy, Yukio Tani, he went under the management of a performer, a strongman performer called William Bankier, and he became a sensation in the music halls. He became an absolute sensation. He was unbeaten for years.
Challenge matches, yeah?
Challenge matches, wrestlers, and there's some discussion that some of them might have been fixed to make them more interesting, but basically I think he was pretty legit. He had a lot of contests and he beat everybody. You have to bear in mind that the people he was beating and the wrestlers he was fighting and so on were fighting using his rule set. And he was using jiu-jitsu tricks they didn't know, like collar chokes and things like that the wrestlers hadn't seen. So he was beating everyone. And Yoneshi, this guy here, he was also involved, although he became more involved in teaching ultimately. But in terms of stardom, Yukio Tani at this time was a superstar. He was a superstar. And then other Japanese started to come across. 1904, a very good jiu-jitsu expert called Taro Miyake came over and defeated Yukio Tani. Now, in the work of Richard Bourne, who's a historian, it seems that there might have been some discussion between them beforehand that it would have been an organized contest. And Tani was quite surprised at just how strong Miyake was, couldn't defeat him. And there's some suggestion that Tani actually gave up. Miyake was so strong.
Yeah, how big was he, Dave? Because he doesn't look that big to me.
They're both small. They were both small men. So, and this was the thing that caught the public's imagination.
Yeah.
Was that they were able to beat people much bigger.
Yeah.
And a lot of the articles at the time, it was all about how small people could use jiu-jitsu to beat big people. It was about skill. And it was actually very popular with women. Yoneshi in particular ran women's classes and taught women. One of his students, we'll talk about in a bit, was Edith Garrod. So Edith Garrod was a very prominent, a famous jiu-jitsu person from this time.
Okay.
So those guys were really the ones who brought jiu-jitsu to the UK. These two in particular.
What style of jiu-jitsu did they bring to the UK then?
So they were both students of a dojo in Osaka of Yataro Handa. And so they weren't judo players. They did different styles of jiu-jitsu. And the dojo of Yataro Handa had a collaboration with a jiu-jitsu master called Matemon Tanebi. And Tanebi was a ground fighting expert. And at this dojo in Osaka, they really experimented and developed the ground fighting game. And so these two guys were expert in this. When they arrived, a couple of years after they arrived, they both wrote books. So Yukio Tani and Taro Miyake wrote a book called The Game of Jiu-Jitsu. And Yoneshi, around the same time, wrote a book called The Textbook of Jiu-Jitsu as Practiced in Japan. Technically, they're very similar to judo. So these guys, even though they were from a different jiu-jitsu style, there was a lot of common techniques practiced. When you're competing, I guess the same solutions were found. When you're competing with the same rule set, the same solutions were found. And so a lot of the techniques, they obviously had a good working knowledge of judo, although the ground game was where the focus was. And if you look at the books, particularly The Game of Jiu-Jitsu with Yukio Tani and Taro Miyake, there's a large emphasis on ground techniques. And that was really their game. Their instructor, Tanebi, was famous in Japan for fighting members of the Kodokan and just taking them to the ground and beating them. And Jigoro Kano, he really didn't like as much the ground game as the standing game. He preferred the standing game. I think particularly from a self-defense point of view, if you go on the ground and there's multiple attackers, it's more difficult. So he preferred judo players to stand. But when his men were getting beaten, he got Tanebi to teach the Kodokan his groundwork, and that's how the Kodokan started to develop a bigger ground game. So those two books, the two books, particularly Yoneshi's and Tani's books, there were other books around at the time, but they became quite influential in the UK, and they were in print for a long time. And they weren't just influential in the UK, they were influential worldwide. And if I know you've read Roberto Pereira's work on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in the second volume, he suggests that one of the sources of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu could have been Tani and Miyake's book, The Game of Jiu-Jitsu, given the extent of the groundwork that was there and the fact that this book was popular in Brazil.
Okay.
So Yeah.
Yeah, so this is roughly 20 years before the Gracies 25 years before the Gracies start getting hold of jiu-jitsu.
That's right. And actually, although Tani didn't travel to Brazil, this guy Yuneshi, he went by a stage name of Raku, and he was part of Maeda's troupe, 1915, 1916, that was touring Brazil, doing jiu-jitsu contests. And Maeda had come through London as well. Maeda had come through and trained with these guys in London. They went to Europe, then they went to South America.
Okay. So how did the jiu-jitsu in the UK really start evolving from this period then, Dave?
So it was really through the music halls. If I stop share, let me get another image up here.
Yeah.
So this is a music hall poster from 1905.
Yeah.
If I can find this. Can you see this advertisement here?
Yeah, mate.
Liverpool Empire, 1905. So this is typical of what was happening across the UK at this time. And it would be like a variety show here. At the bottom, you can see Taro Miyake, world champion jiu-jitsu wrestler of Japan, or the champion jiu-jitsu wrestler of Japan. If I just zoom in a little bit, I don't know, can you see me zooming in here?
Yeah, I've got you, mate.
You can see the sums of money.
£100, I can see.
You know, 1905, this is a huge sum of money. They're obviously extremely confident they're not going to lose anything. And they would tour the UK and they would teach students all over the UK the art of jiu-jitsu. And you got pockets of activity and people developing and then trying to make a living themselves. And this developed for a period of time. Yoneshi's dojo. So both Tani and Miyake's dojo, that the club they were running in London, didn't last particularly long. Yoneshi's club lasted longer. When Yoneshi left London to tour Europe, a couple of his students took it over. It was the Golden Square Dojo, and it was William Garrett, Edith Garrett took that over in 1908, and they just kept it running. So there was a dojo then running in London based on the jiu-jitsu that Yoneshi and Tani had brought. You start to see adaptations to British styles of fighting. So obviously boxing and wrestling were how people were taught to fight in Britain. And so you saw the adaptations where people were doing throws and so on from punches.
Just before you go on to that, Dave, one thing I want to pick out about that poster, I can clearly see here, this offer is especially directed to Monroe. Now, I don't know who they are referring to with Monroe there, and Hackenschmidt. Now, I'm sure he's a strong man. I've seen him before. Right. Was he a pro wrestler?
That's correct. Yeah. And these rivalries developed, and they were a way of generating publicity. So they'd call each other out. And the same thing was happening in Brazil, you know, with the Japanese calling each other out, and you know, Carlos Gracie promoting his guys against others. It was the same here in the UK. The promoters were promoting their guys, trying to generate interest in contests to make as much money as they could. This was how the publicity and the money was generated. So the Golden Square Dojo continued into the 1920s. Obviously, there was the First World War. A lot of people who would have been practicing jiu-jitsu or teaching it would have gone in the war. William Garrett was too old, but himself and Edith lost their son in the First World War, but they continued teaching jiu-jitsu afterwards. And in 1918, a Japanese guy called Gunji Koizumi established the Budokai in London, and that was a center for Japanese martial arts. And 2 years later, Jigoro Kano visited, and they converted to judo. Now, the terms judo and jiu-jitsu were used interchangeably at this period. Even in Japan, the term judo wasn't adopted in the school curriculum until the 1930s. So when people talked about jiu-jitsu, they could have meant, I mean, judo was essentially a style of jiu-jitsu. That's how it was viewed. It wasn't a sport as such. And so this was how it developed. And a lot of the Japanese who came through Europe or came through Great Britain trained at the Budokai. There was a strong concentration there. And there were other jiu-jitsu schools around. There was the British Jujitsu Society, which I've mentioned before, which was more of a commercial type of entity where they had prize fights. But there was an interaction between the two. Not so much a rivalry. But then pretty much from that point on, it became judo. I think a lot of people were interested in training with the Japanese. And jiu-jitsu became a lot more of a kind of an eclectic group of people. You know, the odd dojo here and there who decided they weren't going to call themselves judo, they were going to stay jiu-jitsu. And I think as judo became more sportified after the Second World War, that particularly became a focus. Yeah. So that's really how it developed. So jiu-jitsu in the UK essentially became judo, except for other little pockets of activity.
Okay. Just talk a little bit more about William and Edith, because I was reading about Edith and William the other night, and she lived to about 99 years of age. I think she passed away in 1971 or something like that. And she did suffer at jiu-jitsu in the end with, here we are. And she was the first female, like, martial arts superstar, really, wasn't she?
She was, yeah. Can you see on the screen the image of Edith with a police officer?
Yes, mate, yeah.
Yeah, so she and her husband William had come through, first of all, Bartetsu, then they'd trained with Yuneshi in Jiu-Jitsu, and then they'd taken on that Golden Square Dojo. And Edith became very prominent because she started teaching the bodyguard of the suffragettes. And the bodyguard were the group of women who protected the top suffragettes in the various legal things that were playing out. And I think it was as much political as it was actually effective, and it got a lot of publicity. And she would do demonstrations around London. She would wear, when she was doing the demonstrations, she'd wear a red jacket to mark her, so she was easily identified. She was usually throwing William around, but on this occasion, in this picture, you can see there's a guy dressed up as a policeman, and she's demonstrating a technique. So from this arm grab here, she does a scissors throw, which was a very popular jiu-jitsu technique at the time.
Yeah.
And so she became extremely famous for the suffragette. So it was called suffragette because it was suffragettes learning jiu-jitsu. Of course, they up on the lead up to the First World War, of course, this political unrest died down as the war started. The women got behind the war movement, and then ultimately, of course, they got the vote. It's hard to say whether jiu-jitsu was important or in a practical sense in that, but it was certainly a political tool used by the suffragettes.
Yeah. Do you feel that they were legit practitioners with their skill set, with from who they obviously developed from?
I think I think Edith Gard would have certainly been legit. She had been involved with Bartetsu from 1900, and so you're talking at least 10, 15 years. Yeah. She'd have had development with the top Japanese instructors who were in London at that time. How good the other suffragettes were, it's hard to say. They were also trained to use Indian clubs, the exercise routine. They used those as weapons as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, how practical this was. Fighting police officers, or was it just a political stunt?
Yeah.
But I think Edith was she would have been a legit practitioner for sure.
So if we move forward now, Dave, towards like the Second World War, What about the development of jiu-jitsu, like post Second World War?
So there were two strands, really, Gav. There was obviously judo, and the term jiu-jitsu still being used interchangeably, was still there, and it was, it was developing more. And in Japan, of course, the judo martial arts had been banned by the Americans after the Second World War. Judo got to be practiced again because it became a sport. So it called itself a sport, and it became more popular. And in 1960, was it 1964 or 68, it became, at the Tokyo Olympics, it became an Olympic sport. And you started to, huge coverage and popularity then. And I think that's where the majority of the jiu-jitsu was done, through the judo movement. You then had other strands kind of reinventing themselves, I think, after the war. You had guys like James Blundell, who came up with the British Jujitsu Association and his syllabus. And there's good evidence. If you look at the work that Yuneshi published, and also his student William Garrett, he published a book called The Complete Jiu-Jitsuan. And the technical component within those books is very, very similar to what is in the British Jiu-Jitsu Association syllabus, particularly Garrett's book, where he's blocking punches and doing techniques from punches. And I think that's a credible source of British Jiu-Jitsu. And I think what happened, whether it was the guys who were then practicing it or developing it or organizing the syllabus, it became more of this kind of kata-based element against the punches. And things like full Nelsons, wrestling attacks, so on. It became more focused on fighting British style fights, and then started to incorporate various other elements of other martial arts as they came. So it's a hybrid system. It became a hybrid system rather than anything focused on a particular Japanese school. But interestingly, it seemed to neglect a lot of the ground grappling.
So it became more of a hybrid self-defense system than a sporting grappling content. That's
right. So there was, I think initially there was virtually no sporting element to it at all. Yeah, which is in contrast to what happened the other side of the ocean, where you had very similar development up to the war. But then, of course, I think in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there were a number of reasons why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu developed differently from really the same kind of source. And Robert Drysdale, in his interview, talked about several of those.
Yeah. So what would the world look like without Bartitsu?
So that's a good question. So Tony Wolf's going to come and join the podcast, and he's a real expert in this. But if Edward Barton Wright hadn't trained in Japan and hadn't taken across Yuki Otani and Yuneshi, we wouldn't have had those textbooks. We wouldn't have had those textbooks that then laid the foundation for the jiu-jitsu in the UK. And according to Roberto Pedreira, potentially also in Brazil, they were influential in Brazil as well, you wouldn't necessarily, or at least not in the same time scale, had the influx of Japanese coming through the Bartitsu school and subsequently the dojos of Tani and Yuneshi, the likes of Maeda, that were then using that as a staging post to go into Europe and then into South America. You wouldn't have had the same reach potentially. So it could have developed differently. You might have had a much stronger Kodokan Judo emphasis flowing through, where you had people who were exclusively Kodokan trained, and basically Judo was the product that came around. I think the fact that you had the Bartitsu school and those early Japanese pioneers coming over, you had Jiu-Jitsu coming over, and that's what stuck. But it could look very different potentially, and it'd be interesting to see Tony Wolf's opinion on this.
Yeah. Any idea why during that time frame, like 1880 to like 1910, why there was a lot of Japanese practitioners traveling? How come they hadn't done it before? I know after that you had Kimura, and Kimura used to do challenge matches, and he even did some pro wrestling matches and stuff like that. But how come it was very organic for that period, Dave? Any ideas there?
I think there are a couple of reasons. Japan had been a very closed country for hundreds of years, and it had just started to open up. And a lot of Westerners were traveling to Japan and learning these kind of, I suppose they must have been mystical fighting systems and taking them back. And there were also there were economic reasons why people left Japan and traveled to the UK and Brazil. And you had quite a large influx of Japanese coming through Europe and to London, and also to Brazil in particular. So I think that it was just at that particular time, maybe a combination of cultural and economic reasons that led to this explosion of Japanese culture appearing at other parts of the world.
So going forward, how did British Jiu-Jitsu, what's like the future for British Jiu-Jitsu?
Well, it's a good question, and I guess that everyone will have a different view. If you look at how, in my opinion, if you look at how rule sets, competition rule sets have led the development of other martial arts, so MMA, BJJ, Judo, the rule set kind of defines how the martial arts practiced and developed. And there is competition format now in British Jiu-Jitsu. You have things like the continuous fighting. And I don't think it's happened yet, at least not on a widespread level, but at some point, the syllabus or how people train will have to reflect how the competitions are set up for people to develop. And I think probably competition, if you look, I mean, you can see it in the other martial arts, competition has really led to evolution and development. And I think that will have to come in British Jiu-Jitsu. And that's probably where the biggest developments are going to come. And it might come slightly later than in other styles because we haven't had that competition focus. But as that develops and as that rule set develops, then probably the continuous fighting rule set will develop the evolution. I mean, what do you think, Gav, yourself, having been exposed to the kind of the continuous fighting rule set, based on your experiences in BJJ as well? How do you think that will? Because I think there's scope for development within the various components.
Yeah, I think no one's ever really put their finger on it properly yet, and I don't think anyone's decided the exact rule set that will take them forward. So, for example, I think there's a couple of issues. I think you need to nail down a rule set which everyone agrees on in British Jiu-Jitsu. Because, for example, like the IBJJF with the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, everyone knows the rule set in stone. Okay? There are different grappling organizations out there like NAGAs and ADCCs that do different rule sets. We all know that, okay? But IBJJF, everyone knows this is the rule set and this is it. With the British Jiu-Jitsu, we need to not change rule sets and get a rule set which works and they stick to. I think that's like one of the biggest things. The changing of the rules, different variations of things, I don't think it works. I think that you need to amalgamate more groundwork in. I think that you need semi-contact and I think you need full contact. I'm a big hater of semi-contact. I think you could do semi-contact with kids for obvious reasons, but I think when it's adults, it needs to be full contact. Gum shields in, full contact. Okay? And then if people are drawing blood, right? No instant DQ. I just think obviously there's a timeout. Like you do in MMA, you got to cut Can the cut be dealt with? Can the bleeding nose be dealt with? If not, you lose the match. But
It'd be interesting to go on, Gav.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, like if you catch someone and they draw blood and then you get disqualified, I detest that, hate it.
Just looking at the rule set, I mean, it'd be interesting to speak to the people who developed that rule set because they must have had something in mind. But if you look at the ground game, I look at it as a kind of hybrid between a judo newaza and a BJJ ground game, where you don't have the contest isn't over after a nippon, for example, but you've got the osikomi, which are the pins, and you're scoring points for the pins. Where so your typical judo holds, they'll all start scoring you points. And a submission, I could be wrong on this, but I think a submission doesn't end the contest; it just gets you some points as well.
Yeah.
So they've kind of got a hybrid going on, and yet it's only 60 seconds. So if you pin somebody, and the pins are shorter in duration, 5-second pin. It'd be great to listen to the rationale where those rules have come from.
And remember, you got shin guards on, and you got MMA gloves on as well to try and grapple with. So passing someone's guard with shin guards on, if you're in half guard, stuff like that, it's much more difficult. So your gi chokes with your gloves on because the gloves come up over the wrist, much more difficult.
Very difficult.
So your game's got to evolve as a practitioner. But they just need to decide exactly what they're going to go with stone in stone, and then once they've got that, then people can work towards competing in that sport, and it stays for a period of time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But personally, I don't like the pin neither, because the bigger, stronger person always wins the pin. And then just lie on top. So, I personally wouldn't have a 3-minute fight. Okay, I would have a 5-minute fight, a 5-minute round, and then if you're standing, instead of let's put it to you another way, right? As a practitioner of martial arts, you're always told to work to your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses, aren't you? So let's say at the moment they do 3 minutes, a minute standing. There's a 15-second change there where you get your grip to go into your randori, 45 seconds, and then you've got a minute on the floor. Yeah? So you're 3 minutes in total. So what I would do, I'd have a 5-minute round. And if, let's say I'm fighting you, and you're beating me on the stand-up, okay? You're jabbing away, you're hitting me with good, clean strikes. I'm losing that battle. Instead of me staying there for a period of time losing, why can't I do a double leg and shoot and take you down and score points? Why can't I leg kick? Why can't I use my kicks more? So the kicks are only allowed above the waist, but the problem is you kick above the waist and your leg gets caught and then you get taken down. They score that as a throw against you. And when you kick above the waist, the chances are, unless you get a clean kick head strike, if you kick to the body, someone catches the leg, cups the leg. So the chances are then that by throwing a kick, you're going to get taken down off it. But there's no leg kicks involved, anything like that. But the shin pad's on, so why aren't leg kicks involved?
Yeah, and I think if you take the rule set as it is currently, and that was the basis to which we would work towards, then does the syllabus reflect best practice in those various domains according to those rules? So, for example, if you're grappling and you've got the gloves and the shin guards on, I mean, maybe an arm bar is going to be your most common submission because your chokes are going to be more difficult.
Yeah.
But the typical British Jiu-Jitsu syllabus that I learned didn't map onto that in any way. We weren't developing arm bars throughout that. What you then have is a separate kind of competition focus. You do a couple of times before a competition, but I wasn't developing ways of nailing arm bars with competition kit on. and also, in the syllabus didn't really reflect that. Okay, well, if in the sparring I can catch a leg and take someone down, then when that becomes a part of the competition, my feeling is that the syllabus should then adapt to then, okay, this is going to be a focus, so people need to be competent at doing this. Whether the rule set's the best one or not, I don't think. I think the competition's a separate thing, and it's not currently influencing the evolution of British Jiu-Jitsu because the syllabus is absolutely rigid in many cases.
I'd love to know. I don't know who would give us the answer for this, Dave, but I'd love to know where, because if you look back years and years ago, and you go on YouTube and you look at the old clips and that, a lot of them were doing demonstrations and a lot of them were doing techniques, and I'd love to know what time period and why they started doing competitions when they weren't competition based, and what the reason was why they said, right, now we need to start doing competitions.
Yeah, I don't
probably
know.
Probably the 80s, probably the late 80s.
I think, well, we spoke to John last week, John Idle.
Yeah.
He's probably he was probably around at that time. Whether he was
Yeah.
involved in the committees or not, I don't know, but he might have a view on that. We could ask John.
Yeah, I'll ask John about that. I'll ask John. But Dave, that's an absolutely on the origins of British Jiu-Jitsu, absolutely fascinating discussion. We're going to get more people on the podcast who can go deeper into like books and other topics on what you've just touched on there. Okay, so we're bringing the podcast to the close. If you like the content you're hearing, give us a like, give us a subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Instagram, the Gavin Davis Podcast. We will be back with future episodes with more fascinating topics and guests. So keep listening out. Good night, everyone.
Cheers. Good night.
There's a brand new podcast on the scene talking all things martial arts. If you've never seen a podcast, it's a brilliant place to start. So like, subscribe or download to the best thing on the net. Yes, he really is that tiny. Please do not adjust your set. You can watch it on your telly. You can listen on the go. Tell all your friends and family. Tell everyone you know. Feel free to leave a comment. Tune in, give us a share. The only host that I know gets his keys from Build-A-Bear. The Gavin Davis Podcast. The Gavin Davis Podcast. Jump on board, we'll have a real blast on the Gavin Davis Podcast. A captivating podcast streaming straight into your house. He's a little pocket rocket. He's the Welshman's mighty mouse. Great guests and conversations that won't bore you to tears. Thank God he's where